Now, let's head over the ditch where a recent spate of shootings in Auckland is being blamed on the Australian government, would you believe? A prominent Maori leader has slammed the policy of deporting people with criminal convictions, known as 501s, back to New Zealand. National Mori Authority Chairman Matthew Tukaki is calling for planes to be turned around to stem local violence, as New Zealand is essentially, according to him, being turned into a penal colony for undesirables. To discuss if the policy is really causing such social issues, I'm joined by Dr Muriel Newman from the New Zealand Centre for Political Research. Good evening to you, Doctor.
Good evening.
Now, Muriel, I mean, this 501 policy is being blamed for a rising gang violence, particularly in Auckland. Is this actually what's going on?
So, since 2014, there's been around 2,300 deportees from Australia. And without a doubt, it has led to a lot of competition between the gangs. And so what's happening now is that there is more gun violence. And the reality is that the government's response to this has been probably, to use a polite word, quite inadequate.
But the obvious question for Australia and Australians is that if we've got people who come from New Zealand and come to our country and then turn out to be criminals and they're not citizens of Australia, why should we not deport them back to New Zealand?
Well, look, you should deport them back to New Zealand. New Zealand's got that same policy as well. If people come to your country, commit crimes bad enough, then they should be sent back home. But the reality is that in New Zealand, because the number of gang members coming back here has been increasing, because the government has not had an adequate response to this, then it is causing trouble in the streets. Matthew Tukaki has jumped on a bandwagon. He loves chasing headlines, and he also loves blaming other people for the problems of Māori. So usually it's colonisation or racism, and now with gangs it's Australia. So you have every right to do what you're doing, and I would say that the response of our government has not been adequate.
Well, this National Maori Authority Chairman, Matthew Tukaki, he says he wants to turn the planes around. I mean, how does he propose to do this? Is he going to fly up into the air and sort of turn their noses around and send them back to Australia? I mean, what does he think we can actually do? Why should Australia be the dumping ground for New Zealand criminals?
Look, there's no way that, his suggestion is a serious suggestion, and certainly I'm 100% sure our government would never countenance anything like that. But the reality is, as I said, he's chasing headlines. He sees this as a great way of making international news. And that's all he's doing. So the reality is that you have your right to send back people to New Zealand who have committed crimes and breached the rules in Australia. And our New Zealand government simply has to step up and do better. What's happening here is that our Prime Minister recently created headlines of her own by giving $2.75 million to the mongrel mob for drug rehabilitation. And so she's got a soft on gangs approach and a be kind to everyone else approach. And of course, it's just not working. And people are seeing that in the gang violence on the streets. And Matthew Tukaki is jumping in on the, there is a media opportunity there, but it's a totally stupid suggestion.
We should apparently import them all to Australia. But I mean, this is a question really, isn't it, about a country's sovereignty. I mean, whether it's Australia or New Zealand or UK or South Africa, I mean, any country on earth ought to have the right to deport people who are not citizens of that country who commit crimes in that country. And it's not as though we're deporting everybody. I mean, the threshold is if you get a custodial sentence of more than a year. So, you know, even minor drug offences for most people probably wouldn't even see you sent back to New Zealand. You've got to do something reasonably serious to get a custodial sentence of more than a year. Is the suggestion here that nations should not have the sovereignty and the ability to do what they want with their own country, and what, they must harbour criminals from other countries?
Well, I think that's the view of one person who's quite radical. The issue too for New Zealand is that there's something like we have 65,000 Australians living in our country, but you have 650,000 New Zealanders living in Australia. And so it's a scale issue as well. But look, it comes back to what I said. It's a lack of adequate response from our government of dealing with this escalating gang problem. It's not as if it's just occurred. It's been going on for a number of years. It's been building. And the previous government, they had a hard-on-crime approach. And of course, this lot came in and changed it around. And so now we're reaping the benefits. Interestingly, gun violence is escalating. And a few years ago, the government did crack down on guns, but it was the guns of licensed firearm owners. It was people who were law-abiding citizens who had their guns taken away from them, and far tougher measures came in for them. And meanwhile, the criminals got away scot-free. It's just completely ridiculous what's going on here.
It's always the way. Dr. Muriel Newman, thank you for your time.
Thank you.